The Lioness of Jhansi. Chapter 1. The untold story of India's warrior queen. The dust hung thick in the air that morning. June 17, 1858. Near a place called Kota Ki Sarai, just outside the fortress city of Gwalior. The earth was scorched, the sky bleached white by a merciless sun. In the distance, British cavalry formed their lines, sabres catching the light like shards of broken glass. Their horses stamped and snorted, sensing what was coming. On the opposite ridge, a smaller force waited. Among them rode a figure that made the British officers pause, not because of size or station, but because of the quiet certainty that emanated from this warrior. Dressed in the simple uniform of a cavalry soldier, a sword strapped to each hip, reins gripped firmly in weathered hands. On the rider's back, tied securely with cloth, a small boy clung silently. The Rani of Jhansi had arrived for her final battle, but this moment, this collision of fate and fury, was not where her story began. To understand the woman who would make an empire tremble, we must travel back 3 decades, to a holy city on the banks of the Ganges, where a girl was born into a world that would try to break her, only to discover she was unbreakable. This is the story of Manikarnika Tambe, the story of Lakshmibai, the story of a queen who refused to bow, a mother who fought with a child on her back, and a warrior whose name would echo through centuries. This is the story of the woman the British called their most dangerous enemy. This is the story of Jhansi Ki Rani. Chapter 2. The girl called Manu. The sacred city of Varanasi had witnessed countless souls arrive and depart for thousands of years. On November 19, 1828, another soul took its first breath there, though the exact year remains disputed by historians. Some sources claim 1827, others 1835, but what matters is not the precise date recorded in ledgers that would burn in future fires. What matters is what that child would become. They named her Manikarnika, after the holy ghat where pilgrims came to cleanse themselves in the Ganges. Her parents, Manikarnika Tambe and Bhagirathi Sapre, were Marathi Brahmins, educated and respected. Her father served in the court of Peshwa Baji Rao II at Bithur, a position of honor. The Peshwa, charmed by the bright-eyed child who would toddle into court sessions, gave her a nickname that stuck, Chabili, the playful one. But playfulness requires joy, and joy requires a mother. Manikarnika was 4 years old when Bhagirathi died. The loss carved something hollow into the child, a space that grief fills differently in the young. There were no tears recorded, no dramatic mourning, just a little girl who stopped speaking for weeks, who wandered the house looking for someone who would never return. Her father faced a choice that would define both their lives. In 1832, a Brahmin girl was expected to be raised in silence and shadows, prepared for marriage, taught domestic skills, kept from anything that might make her too bold or too bright. Widows were especially vulnerable, and without her mother's guidance, Manikarnika could have been married off young to secure her future. Morapant chose differently. He took his daughter with him to Bithur, to the Peshwa's court, and there, in that unusual household, Manikarnika received an education that would have been unthinkable for most girls of her time. The Peshwa Baji Rao II had been deposed by the British after the Third Anglo-Maratha War, his power reduced to a generous pension and a court in exile. But he maintained the traditions of training young men for leadership and warfare, and in his household, the daughter of his trusted advisor was permitted to train alongside the boys. Manikarnika learned to read and write in Hindi and Marathi. She studied religious texts and history. But more importantly, she learned to ride horses before most girls her age learned to cook. She learned archery, sending arrow after arrow into targets until her small fingers bled and hardened. She learned sword fighting, the clash of practice blades ringing through the courtyards. She practiced malakamba, the traditional gymnastics performed on a vertical pole, building strength and balance that would serve her in ways no one could yet imagine. Her closest companions during these years were the Peshwa's sons and nephew, Nana Sahib, who would grow into the adopted heir of Baji Rao, Rao Sahib, who shared her quick temper and quicker mind, and Tantia Tope, whose skills with military strategy would one day make him legendary. They competed, they fought, they learned together, and crucially, they learned that Manikarnika could match them blow for blow, ride for ride, shot for shot. One story from her youth captures the essence of who she was becoming. During a training session, one of the older boys mocked her for being a girl, suggesting she should be learning to manage a household instead of wielding weapons. Manikarnika said nothing. The next day, during mounted combat practice, she unhorsed him in front of the entire court, then offered him her hand to help him up. "A household needs managing," she said, pulling him to his feet. "But so does a battlefield. I'll learn both." The Peshwa, watching from the veranda, laughed until tears ran down his face. "That child," he told Morapant later, "will shake the world someday." He had no idea how right he was. By her early teens, Manikarnika could ride a horse at full gallop while firing arrows accurately. She could fence with grown men and not always lose. She understood military tactics from studying the Marathas' historical campaigns. She could quote from Hindu scriptures and discuss philosophy. But more than skills, she had developed something rarer, a sense of self that refused to be diminished by anyone's expectations. The girl called Manu was ready to become a queen. She just didn't know it yet. Chapter 3. The Queen of Jhansi. In May 1842, Manikarnika's life transformed, in the way that lives often did for young women of her time. An offer came from Jhansi, a small but strategically important princely state in Bundelkhand. Raja Gangadhar Rao Newalkar, the Maharaja of Jhansi, needed a wife. At 14 years old, though some sources suggest she was older, Manikarnika was married to the ruler of Jhansi. The marriage was both a dramatic elevation and a cage. She went from being the daughter of a court advisor to being a queen. But with that title came expectations, restrictions, and traditions that would have smothered most women. Following Hindu tradition, she was given a new name, Lakshmibai, after Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth and fortune. But more fitting was Lakshmi's other aspect. The goddess was also known for her fierce independence and strength. Rani Lakshmibai, as she was now known, entered the palace of Jhansi with her head held high. The other queens and court ladies expected her to conform, to adopt the purdah system that kept women hidden from public view, to become soft and decorative and silent. She refused. Lakshmibai continued to ride horses, to practice with weapons, to train in the early morning hours before the palace fully awoke. Gangadhar Rao, to his credit, did not try to stop her. British accounts would later characterize him as weak or debauched, but Indian sources paint a different picture. A cultured man who recognized his wife's unusual spirit and chose not to break it. Their relationship was complex. He was significantly older, scholarly, more interested in religious devotion than ruling. She was young, energetic, driven. But they found their way to mutual respect. In 1851, joy arrived in the form of a son. They named him Damodar Rao, and for 4 precious months, Lakshmibai knew the fierce love that makes mothers brave beyond reason. She would ride with the infant secured to her back, training even as she nursed, planning a future where her son would rule a free Jhansi. Then the child died. Medical records don't specify the cause, but infant mortality was tragically common. One day there were 3 people in the royal chamber. The next day there were 2, and the silence between them grew vast. Grief does different things to different people. Gangadhar Rao retreated deeper into his religious practices. Lakshmibai threw herself into understanding the administration of Jhansi, learning every detail of governance, fortifications, revenue collection, and military organization. As if by knowing everything, she could control the uncontrollable. But some things remain beyond control. By early 1853, Gangadhar Rao was dying. The exact illness isn't clear from historical records, but his decline was steady and obvious, and with no surviving heir, both he and Lakshmibai knew what the British would do. They knew about Lord Dalhousie's Doctrine of Lapse, the policy that allowed the East India Company to annex any princely state whose ruler died without a natural male heir. The doctrine was an abomination to Indian tradition. For centuries, Hindu law had permitted adoption in cases where a biological heir was absent. An adopted son had full rights to property, titles, and succession. It was an accepted, honored practice. But the British had other plans. They wanted territories, not tradition. They wanted control, not continuity. On his deathbed, Gangadhar Rao made one final stand. On November 21st, 1853, in the presence of a British political officer, he formally adopted Anand Rao, the son of his cousin. The boy was renamed Damodar Rao, after the infant they had lost. The adoption was recorded. A letter was written to the British authorities, requesting that his widow Lakshmibai be recognized as regent until the child came of age. Gangadhar Rao died shortly after. He was buried with full honors, and Lakshmibai became a widow at 25 years old. According to some Hindu traditions, she could have chosen sati, self-immolation on her husband's funeral pyre. Some conservative voices might have expected it, but Lakshmibai had no intention of dying. She had a son to protect and a kingdom to save. She shaved her head, as was traditional for widows. She wore white. She observed the mourning period. But she also did something unprecedented. She wrote directly to the British East India Company, arguing her case for Damodar Rao's right to succession. The British response came like a slap. In March 1854, Governor-General Lord Dalhousie issued his decision. The adoption was not recognized. Jhansi would be annexed under the Doctrine of Lapse. Lakshmibai would be given a pension of 60,000 rupees annually and ordered to leave the palace and fort. When the British officer came to deliver the official order, Lakshmibai stood before him in the throne room of Jhansi. Her voice was steady, her gaze direct. "Main apni Jhansi nahin doongi," she said. "I will not give up my Jhansi." The officer reported back that the Rani was being unreasonable. He had no idea that he had just witnessed the lighting of a fuse. Chapter 4. The Doctrine of Lapse. Injustice descends. To understand what happened next, you must understand the machinery of British imperialism in India. It was not merely conquest through military might. It was conquest through legal technicality, through policy designed to look rational while achieving systematic theft. Lord Dalhousie, the Governor-General of India from 1848 to 1856, was the architect of aggressive expansion. He believed, genuinely believed, that British rule was superior to Indian governance. He saw himself as a modernizer, bringing railways and telegraphs to a backward land. That he did so while dismantling sovereignty and crushing kingdoms was, to his mind, simply the cost of progress. The Doctrine of Lapse was his most effective weapon. The policy had been articulated as early as 1834, by the Court of Directors of the East India Company, but Dalhousie wielded it with unprecedented enthusiasm. Between 1848 and 1856, 8 princely states fell under the doctrine: Satara, Jaitpur, Sambalpur, Baghat, Udaipur, Jhansi, Nagpur, and others. The principle was brutally simple. If a ruler died without a biological male heir, his kingdom would lapse to the British. Adoption, that ancient Hindu practice, that foundation of succession law across Indian civilization, was declared invalid. Unless the British specifically approved an adoption beforehand, it didn't count. This wasn't just about territory, it was about money. Each annexed state added to British revenue. Satara alone added £1 million to annual income. Nagpur added even more. Jhansi, with its strategic location and developed infrastructure, was a prize worth claiming. For the Indian rulers, the doctrine was existential terror. It meant that disease, accident, or age could suddenly strip away not just personal power, but the entire legacy of their lineage. Kingdoms that had existed for generations could be erased by bureaucratic decree. Lakshmibai understood all of this. She was not naive. She knew the British wanted Jhansi. What she couldn't accept was the rank injustice of it, the casual dismissal of her adopted son's rights, the betrayal of agreements made in good faith. She hired John Lang, an Australian lawyer living in India, to represent her case. Together, they drafted appeals to the British authorities in India and to Parliament in London. The arguments were clear and compelling. Gangadhar Rao had followed all proper procedures. The adoption had been witnessed by a British officer. Hindu law and custom supported the succession. There was no legitimate reason to reject Damodar Rao's claim. The appeals were rejected. In 1854, the British officially annexed Jhansi. Lakshmibai was given her pension and ordered to vacate the Jhansi fort and relocate to a smaller residence, the Rani Mahal. The state treasury was seized. The British flag was raised over the fort. Most women in her position would have taken the pension and disappeared into quiet widowhood. Most men would have negotiated for better terms and accepted defeat. Lakshmibai took the pension but kept the anger. She moved to the Rani Mahal but kept training. And in the privacy of her reduced household, she began to plan. She had loyal followers. officers who had served under her husband, soldiers who respected her more than they respected the British, citizens of Jhansi who saw the annexation as theft. She spoke to them quietly, one by one, testing loyalties, building networks. She established a foundry within the Rani Mahal compound, disguised as a small metalworking operation. There, craftsmen began casting cannons, small ones that could be concealed, then larger ones as the operation grew. Weapons were gathered piece by piece. Powder was stockpiled. She recruited soldiers, offering them pay from her pension. By 1856, she had assembled a force of several hundred trained fighters. She organized them into units, drilling them in the courtyards at dawn. She trained women as well, something virtually unheard of. Jalkari Bai, a woman from the Kori caste, became one of her most trusted warriors, so similar in appearance to the Rani that she could serve as a decoy. The British noticed some of this, of course, but they dismissed it as the harmless activities of a deposed queen, trying to maintain some dignity. Major Erskine, the British political agent in Jhansi, reported that the Rani was troublesome but not dangerous. They were catastrophically wrong. By early 1857, Jhansi was outwardly peaceful. The British flag flew. British officers administered the territory. Trade continued. Courts functioned. Everything appeared normal. Beneath the surface, Lakshmibai had transformed her kingdom into a coiled spring, waiting for the right moment to release. That moment came from an unexpected direction, not from Jhansi itself, but from a garrison 200 miles north, in a place called Meerut. The fuse she had lit was about to meet a much larger explosion. Chapter 5. The Spark of Rebellion. May 10th, 1857. In Meerut, Indian soldiers in the British East India Company's army, called sepoys, mutinied. The immediate trigger was the introduction of new Enfield rifle cartridges. To load the rifle, soldiers had to bite off the end of the cartridge. Rumors spread that the cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. When 85 sepoys refused to use the cartridges, they were court-martialed, shackled, and imprisoned. The next day, their fellow soldiers revolted. They freed the prisoners, killed British officers, and marched on Delhi. Within days, they had seized the city and declared the elderly Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, as their leader. The spark became a wildfire. Across northern India, sepoys rose in rebellion. Some were motivated by the cartridge issue, others by accumulated grievances, low pay, discrimination, disrespect, the sense that the British were deliberately undermining Indian religion and culture. The Doctrine of Lapse had created a class of displaced rulers and their followers who had every reason to support a rebellion. By June, the rebellion reached Jhansi. On June 5th, the sepoys of the 12th Bengal Native Infantry and the 14th Irregular Cavalry, stationed in Jhansi, mutinied. They killed 2 British officers, freed prisoners from the jail, and seized weapons and money. The few dozen British soldiers, civilians and their families fled to the Jhansi fort, hoping its walls would protect them. They sent a message to Lakshmibai, asking for her help, for protection, for the supplies and support that only she could provide. Lakshmibai faced an impossible choice. If she helped the British, she would be seen as a collaborator by the rebelling sepoys and the people of Jhansi who supported them. The sepoys controlled the city and outnumbered any force she could raise. Helping the British might get her killed, and would certainly doom any chance of regaining Jhansi's independence. If she refused to help, the British in the fort would likely die, and she would be blamed for it later, giving the British an excuse to punish her and justify the annexation. If she tried to remain neutral, both sides would see her as the enemy. She sent arms and ammunition to the fort. It was a calculated minimum, enough to show she had not abandoned them entirely, but not enough to meaningfully change their situation. For 2 days, the British held out in the fort while the sepoys besieged it. On June 7th, the British negotiated a surrender in exchange for safe passage out of Jhansi. The sepoys agreed. Then they broke the agreement. The British soldiers, officers, their wives and children, were marched to a garden called Jokan Bagh. There, they were massacred. Somewhere between 40 and 60 people were killed, though exact numbers remain disputed. Men, women, children, all cut down. Lakshmibai was not present. She was at the Rani Mahal. But the massacre happened in her city, under her nominal authority. The British would never forgive it, never forget it, never believe she had no hand in it. Whether she could have prevented it is one of history's open questions. Some sources claim she tried to intervene, others claim she had no power to stop the sepoys. Still others whisper that she looked the other way, that the massacre served her purposes by making reconciliation with the British impossible. The truth is lost to time. What remains is the consequence. From that day forward, the British saw Lakshmibai as complicit in murder, and she knew that when they returned, they would show no mercy. In the chaos following the massacre, the remaining British officials and troops in the region fled or were killed. Jhansi was suddenly without any British presence. The sepoys who had carried out the rebellion marched north to join the siege of Delhi, leaving the city leaderless. Into that vacuum stepped Lakshmibai. She took control of Jhansi's administration. She issued proclamations in her own name. She collected revenue, administered justice, and organized defense. In effect, she reclaimed her kingdom. But Jhansi was not free. In September and October 1857, the neighboring Rajas of Orcha and Datia, both allies of the British, invaded Jhansi. Their motives were simple. They wanted to divide Jhansi's territory between them, using the chaos as cover for land grabs. Lakshmibai mobilized her forces. She personally led the defense, riding at the head of her troops. Her soldiers, seeing their queen on horseback with a sword in her hand, fought with desperate courage. The invaders were repelled, then pursued, then defeated decisively. The victory solidified her position. Jhansi was hers again, held by force of arms and popular support. For a few months, from August 1857 through January 1858, Jhansi was at peace under Lakshmibai's rule. She used that time wisely. She expanded her army to 14,000 soldiers, recruiting from all castes and both genders. She promoted based on skill, not birth. Jalkari Bai commanded a women's regiment. Low-caste soldiers held positions of authority. It was revolutionary for its time. She strengthened Jhansi's fortifications. The walls, already impressive, were reinforced. Cannons were mounted at strategic points. Defensive positions were prepared. The moat around the fort was deepened and filled. She trained her forces relentlessly. Dawn to dusk, drills and exercises, cavalry maneuvers and infantry formations. She trained them for the siege she knew was coming. Because she had no illusions, the British were temporarily distracted by Delhi and Lucknow, major centers of resistance that demanded their full attention. But once those fell, the British would come for Jhansi. They would come for revenge. They would come to make an example. And they would come with overwhelming force. Lakshmibai spent those months preparing her people for the inevitable. She stockpiled grain and ammunition. She gave speeches in the streets, promising that Jhansi would fight, that they would not surrender, that if they fell, they would fall with honor. In the words of Lord Krishna, she told a gathering in the main square, "We will enjoy the fruits of victory if we are victorious. If we are defeated and killed on the battlefield, we shall surely earn eternal glory and salvation." The people cheered. They believed her. They were ready to follow her into fire. In January 1858, the British finished their campaigns in the north. The rebel-held cities fell, one by one. Delhi was retaken in September 1857, after a brutal siege. Lucknow was finally secured in March 1858. And on March 21, 1858, the Central India Field Force under Major General Sir Hugh Rose arrived at the gates of Jhansi. The storm had reached them at last. Chapter 6. The Siege of Jhansi. Sir Hugh Rose was no ordinary commander. At 57 years old, he was experienced, methodical, and utterly ruthless. He had served in Syria, Egypt, and throughout India. His reputation was built on systematic suppression of resistance. Where other British officers might negotiate or show mercy, Rose brought fire and steel. The force he led to Jhansi numbered around 3,000 men, though it varied as reinforcements arrived. It included British regulars, Sikh cavalry, and artillery batteries capable of reducing stone walls to rubble. It was a professional army, well supplied, well trained, designed specifically for one purpose: to crush Indian resistance. Rose's forces approached Jhansi from multiple directions, encircling the city. His scouts reported back with troubling news. The defenses were far more extensive than expected. The 25-foot granite walls were in excellent condition, studded with guns that could fire over the town and into the surrounding countryside. The moat was a real obstacle, deep and wide. The gates were reinforced with iron and wood. Inside the city, 11,500 people had mobilized for defense. Not all were soldiers. Many were civilians who had taken up arms, merchants who knew how to load muskets, farmers who could swing swords, women who had trained in archery. The entire population had become an army. And leading them, coordinating every aspect of the defense, was Lakshmibai. On March 22nd, Rose sent a formal demand for surrender. If the city yielded immediately, he promised minimal punishment. If they resisted, he would show no quarter. The city would be destroyed, and everyone in it would suffer the consequences. The messenger was granted an audience with the Rani. She received him in the courtyard of the palace, surrounded by her commanders. She wore a simple sari, but weapons were visible at her waist. Her hair, grown back from the widow's shave, was pulled back severely. Her eyes were steady. The messenger delivered Rose's ultimatum. Lakshmibai listened without interruption. When he finished, she stood. "You may tell your general," she said clearly, "that Jhansi will fight for independence. We choose battle over surrender. Return to your camp." The messenger left. Within hours, British artillery opened fire. The siege of Jhansi had begun. The bombardment was constant and devastating. British artillery, positioned on the high ground outside the city, sent iron balls crashing into Jhansi's walls. The sound was like continuous thunder. Stones splintered. Dust rose in thick clouds. Buildings inside the city shook with each impact. But Lakshmibai had prepared for this. Repair crews worked through every night, filling breaches with rubble and timber, shoring up weakened sections. Masons worked by torchlight, their hands bloodied and raw. What the British destroyed during the day, the defenders rebuilt before dawn. Jhansi's guns fired back. The cannons Lakshmibai had cast in her foundries proved their worth. British positions took casualties. Supply wagons were destroyed. The siege was supposed to be a simple matter of overwhelming firepower, but the defenders were making the British pay for every yard of ground. Lakshmibai was everywhere. On the walls, encouraging the gunners. In the streets, organizing supply distribution. At the command post, reviewing intelligence from scouts. She slept perhaps 2 hours a night, often on a mat in the fort itself, rather than returning to the palace. The women warriors she had trained proved especially valuable. Jalkari Bai led raids outside the walls at night, hitting British supply lines and disappearing before reinforcements could respond. Other women served as gunners, matching the men shot for shot. The British soldiers, many of whom had never fought against women before, found it deeply unsettling. One British officer wrote in his diary, "The Rani is remarkable. She fights with the determination of a lioness. The women of Jhansi are no less fierce. They have turned their city into a fortress that will cost us dearly." By late March, Rose faced a problem. The siege was taking longer than expected. His supplies were running low. His men were suffering from heat and disease, and intelligence suggested that a relief force was approaching. Tantia Tope, the rebel leader and Lakshmibai's childhood friend, had assembled an army of 20,000 men. They were marching to break the siege of Jhansi, to trap Rose between the city's defenders and the arriving reinforcements. Rose made a calculated decision. On March 31st, he split his force. He left 1,500 men to continue the siege and maintain pressure on the walls. The rest, about 1,500 men, he positioned to face Tantia Tope's approaching army. On April 1st, 1858, the Battle of Betwa was fought. Tantia Tope had numerical superiority, more than 10-to-1 odds. But numbers mean little without organization. His force was a coalition of different groups with different loyalties, armed with a mix of old muskets and outdated artillery. They lacked the discipline and coordination of a professional army. Rose's artillery tore into the first wave of attackers. Precise, devastating volleys cut down hundreds. When the rebel cavalry charged, British infantry formed squares, bristling with bayonets, and held their ground. Tantia Tope's second line failed to support the first due to confusion in command. The battle became a rout. By nightfall, Tantia Tope's army was in retreat, having suffered over 1,500 casualties while inflicting less than 100 on the British. The relief of Jhansi had failed. Inside the city, Lakshmibai received the news with cold fury. She had hoped Tantia Tope would succeed. Now she knew Jhansi stood alone. On April 2nd, Rose returned his full attention to the siege. With Tantia Tope defeated and scattered, there were no more reinforcements coming. It was time to finish this. British engineers had identified the weakest point in Jhansi's walls, a section on the southern side that had taken sustained damage. Throughout April 2nd, they prepared for the final assault. Ladders were built. Breaching equipment was positioned. Orders were given. At 3 in the morning on April 3rd, 1858, 2 columns of British soldiers moved silently through the darkness. One approached the breach in the southern wall. The other carried scaling ladders to assault different points, spreading the defense thin. The attack began with a whistle. The breaching column charged. Defenders opened fire from the walls, muzzle flashes lighting the pre-dawn darkness. British soldiers fell, but others kept coming, scrambling over rubble, pushing through the gap in the wall. Inside the breach, hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Swords clashed. Muskets fired at point-blank range. Men grappled and fell. The breach became a killing ground. But the British kept reinforcing, pouring more men into the gap. At other points along the wall, ladders went up. Defenders tried to push them back, but there were too many points of attack. British soldiers reached the top of the walls, secured footholds, and began fighting their way along the ramparts. Lakshmibai, alerted to the breach, led a counterattack personally. She rode through the streets to the southern section, 1,500 Afghan soldiers and her most loyal warriors following. They crashed into the British forces that had penetrated the walls, driving them back temporarily. For 3 hours, the battle raged inside Jhansi's walls. Street by street, house by house, room by room. The British brought in reinforcements steadily, their professional discipline and superior weapons grinding down the defenders. By mid-morning, the outcome was clear. The British had too many men, too much ammunition, too much organization. Jhansi's defenses were crumbling. Lakshmibai fell back to the fort at the center of the city. Her commanders gathered around her. The choice was stark. Stay and die, or escape and fight another day. One of her advisors urged her to consider Sati, the widow's death, rather than be captured by the British. She looked at him with contempt. "I am not finished fighting," she said. "Jhansi may fall, but the resistance continues. We go to Kalpi, gather whoever can travel. We leave tonight." As darkness fell on April 3rd, 1858, a small group of riders gathered in the fort courtyard. Lakshmibai was mounted on her favorite horse, Badal. Damodar Rao, now 5 years old, was tied securely to her back with strips of cloth. Around her were perhaps 24 of her most trusted soldiers and advisors. The British controlled most of the city, but they had not yet fully secured the fort. There was a brief window. Lakshmibai spurred Badal forward. The horse, as trained and brave as its rider, leaped from a section of the fort wall, clearing a gap that would have killed most riders. The small party thundered through the darkened streets, evading British patrols by luck and speed. By dawn, they were miles away from Jhansi, riding east toward Kalpi. Behind them, the British flag rose over Jhansi fort. Rose's men began systematic looting and destruction. Buildings were burned. Civilians suspected of fighting were killed without trial. The British had taken Jhansi, but it had cost them blood and time, and the woman they most wanted to capture had slipped through their fingers like smoke. Rose would later write in his official report, "The Rani is a wonderful woman, very brave and determined. It is fortunate for us that the men of Jhansi are not all like her." He had no idea that his hardest battles were still ahead. Chapter 7. Flight and Okan. Chapter 7. Flight and regrouping. The ride to Kalpi was 200 miles across hostile territory. British forces controlled many areas. The roads were not safe. With a 5-year-old child tied to her back and only a handful of companions, Lakshmibai rode anyway. They traveled at night mostly, hiding during the day in sympathetic villages or deep forests. Farmers offered them food and shelter, risking British reprisals. Word spread through the countryside. The Rani of Jhansi was still fighting, still free, still dangerous. By late April they reached Kalpi, a strategic town on the Yamuna River. It had become a gathering point for rebel forces. Tantia Tope was there, regrouping after his defeat at Betwa. Rao Sahib, Nana Sahib's nephew, commanded forces there as well. Other leaders of the rebellion had consolidated around Kalpi, making it the next major stronghold of resistance. Lakshmibai's arrival electrified the camp. Here was the queen, who had held Jhansi for 2 weeks against overwhelming odds, who had escaped impossible capture, who rode with a child on her back and fire in her eyes. The soldiers, demoralized by recent defeats, found their courage renewed. An army of 10,000 fighters assembled at Kalpi. Lakshmibai was offered a command position, but the leadership structure became tangled in politics. Tantia Topi, as the senior military commander, was given overall authority. Rao Sahib represented the political leadership, claiming the legacy of the Peshwa title. Lakshmibai was respected, but not given the command authority her skills deserved. It was a fatal mistake. She understood military strategy better than most of the other leaders. She advocated for proper defensive preparations, for discipline in the ranks, for careful planning. Her advice was often ignored. Tantia Tope, for all his bravery, lacked the systematic approach that modern warfare required. Rao Sahib was more concerned with political symbolism than military reality. On May 22, 1858, Rose's forces attacked Kalpi. The battle was a disaster for the defenders. Tantia Tope failed to properly secure his flanks, a basic strategic error. Rose exploited the gap, outmaneuvering the rebel forces. Without proper coordination, the defenders fought in isolated units, rather than as a cohesive army. The British artillery, as always, was devastating and precise. By evening, Kalpi had fallen. The rebel forces scattered. Hundreds were captured or killed. The survivors fled in different directions. But defeat breeds clarity. The surviving rebel leaders, including Lakshmibai, Tantia Tope, and Rao Sahib, gathered in a makeshift camp several miles from Kalpi. They had lost another stronghold. British forces were closing in from multiple directions. The rebellion was collapsing across northern India. Lakshmibai spoke. Her voice was hoarse from shouting orders during the battle, but her mind was sharp. "We cannot keep retreating," she said. "We need a fortress that can withstand a prolonged siege. We need resources to rebuild our forces. We need a symbol that shows we can still strike back." "Gwalior," said someone. "We should take Gwalior." Gwalior was one of the strongest fortresses in India. It sat on a massive hill, its walls virtually impregnable to direct assault. More importantly, it was currently held by Maharaja Jayaji Rao Scindia, who had remained loyal to the British. Taking Gwalior would be both strategically valuable and symbolically powerful. It would show that major territories could still be liberated. There was one problem. Scindia had a large, well-equipped army, and he was a competent commander. Lakshmibai argued that surprise was their only advantage. If they moved quickly, before Scindia could call for British reinforcements, they might overwhelm Gwalior's defenses through shock and audacity. On June 1, 1858, the rebel forces marched on Gwalior. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had something Scindia's forces lacked: desperation and momentum. Scindia brought his army out to meet them at Morar, just outside Gwalior. His forces were impressive on paper, but many of his soldiers were sympathetic to the rebellion. When the fighting began, entire units defected, joining the attackers. Others simply fled. Within hours, Scindia's army had collapsed. He fled to Agra to seek British protection. By evening, rebel forces controlled Gwalior, including its fortress. It was a stunning victory. Nana Sahib was proclaimed Peshwa in a ceremonial restoration of Maratha authority. Rao Sahib became his governor. The treasury and arsenal of Gwalior were seized, providing desperately needed resources. For a brief moment, it seemed the rebellion might be reviving. Lakshmibai, however, felt a deep unease. She had studied enough military history to understand that taking a fortress was easy compared to holding it. Rose's forces would respond quickly. They needed to prepare defenses, organize supply lines, and coordinate their scattered forces. She urged the other leaders to start preparations immediately. Fortifications should be strengthened. Troops should be positioned strategically. Scouts should be sent to monitor British movements. Her advice was acknowledged but not acted upon with sufficient urgency. There was celebration, distribution of captured wealth, political ceremonies. The other leaders seemed to believe they had won a major victory that would change the course of the war. Lakshmibai knew better. She spent her days positioning her own forces, drilling her troops, preparing for what she knew was coming. On June 16, 1858, British forces captured Martyr just outside Gwalior. It had taken them only 2 weeks to respond. Rose had reorganized his forces and marched with typical efficiency. The battle for Gwalior was about to begin, and this time there would be no escape. Chapter 8. The Final Battle. June 17, 1858. Dawn broke over Gwalior with a sky the color of old blood. The air was thick with heat and tension. British forces, under Rose's command, had positioned themselves strategically around the city. Their artillery was set up on high ground, their cavalry organized in precise formations, their infantry ready to advance. Inside Gwalior, the rebel forces scrambled to organize a defense, but the preparations Lakshmibai had advocated for had not been completed. Leadership was divided, forces were scattered, there was confusion about who commanded which units. Lakshmibai gathered her personal force, the soldiers from Jhansi, who had followed her through everything, the women warriors who had trained under her, the cavalry unit she had drilled personally. Perhaps 1,000 fighters in total, loyal beyond death. She dressed in the simple uniform of a cavalry soldier. Loose pants, a tunic, a turban wound tightly. Practical clothes for riding and fighting. No jewelry, no royal insignia. At her hips, she wore 2 swords. Across her back, secured with cloth bindings, Damodar Rao sat quietly. The boy had learned not to cry during battle. Her horse Baddle was saddled and ready. The animal sensed the tension, ears flat, eyes rolling, but steady under her weight. "We're going to Kota Ki Serai," she told her commanders. "If we can hold that position, we can disrupt their supply lines. If we cannot hold it, we fall back to the fort." "And if we cannot reach the fort?" someone asked. Lakshmibai's expression didn't change. "Then we die free." The ride to Kota Ki Serai took them east of Gwalior, toward British positions. It was a calculated risk. If they could strike quickly and withdraw, they might buy time for the defenders. If they were caught in the open, they would be destroyed. British scouts spotted the Indian force approaching. Captain Hanij, commanding a squadron of the 8th Hussars, moved to intercept. The Hussars were elite British cavalry, experienced and disciplined. They saw an Indian force that appeared disorganized, ripe for destruction. They did not initially realize their opponent was Lakshmibai. The 2 forces met in the open ground near Kota Ki Serai. The British charged in classic cavalry formation, sabers drawn, a wall of horses and steel. Lakshmibai drew both her swords. She held one in each hand. A fighting style few could master, but she had practiced until it was instinct. The reins of her horse she gripped between her teeth, a technique she had learned years ago, freeing both hands for combat. "For Jhansi!" she shouted. Her force charged to meet the British. The collision was chaos. Horses screamed, steel clashed, men shouted and died. In the center of it all, Lakshmibai fought with the precision of a lifetime of training. She parried with one blade while striking with the other. She used her horse's momentum to drive through enemy formations. Around her, her warriors fought with matching fury. But the British were simply too many and too well trained. For every hussar that fell, 3 Indians died. The formation began to collapse. Soldiers were being cut down. The retreat would become a rout within minutes. Then Lakshmibai took a hit. Accounts differ on the exact details. Some sources say she was shot by a British trooper. Others claim she was struck by a saber cut. Most likely, it was both. A bullet struck her torso, and as she reeled from the impact, a saber slashed across her body. The wounds were mortal. She knew it instantly. The pain was distant, shock providing a temporary mercy. Blood spread across her tunic, warm and red. Badal, feeling his rider weaken, slowed. Lakshmibai managed to turn the horse away from the fighting, toward a grove of trees where a hermit had a small shelter. Her warriors formed around her, fighting a desperate rearguard action to give their queen those final moments. She reached the hermit's shelter and half fell, half dismounted from Badal. Damodar Rao was gently untied from her back. The boy was crying now, understanding that something terrible was happening. The hermit and several of her soldiers laid her on the ground. There was no medical help that could save her. She had minutes at best. "Do not let the British take my body," she said to the hermit. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Burn me according to our rites. Let no trophy be made of me." The hermit agreed. Lakshmibai looked at Damodar Rao. She tried to smile. "You are brave," she told him. "Always be brave. Remember Jhansi. Remember that we fought." Her eyes closed. Her breathing, already shallow, stopped. The lioness of Jhansi, the queen who had defied an empire, the warrior who had fought with a child on her back, was gone. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, weapon in hand, refusing surrender. The hermit and Lakshmibai's surviving soldiers built a funeral pyre quickly. Traditional rites would have taken days, but they had minutes before British patrols arrived. They placed her body on the pyre, along with her swords and personal effects. Fire was set. As smoke rose into the morning sky, the soldiers stood in silence, tears mixing with blood and dust on their faces. Some sources claim they mourned for 2 days. Others say the cremation took only an hour. What matters is that they honored her final wish. No British soldier would pose with her body. No triumphant photograph would be taken. No trophy would be sent to London. She became ash and memory, which is sometimes the most powerful legacy. British forces arrived at the site later that day. They found the pyre still smoking and realized who had died. Rose was informed. He reportedly stood silent for a long moment. "The most dangerous of all Indian leaders," he finally said. "She fought with remarkable bravery and determination. The Indian Mutiny had produced but one man, and that man was a woman." It was the highest compliment an enemy could give. 3 days after Lakshmibai's death, on June 20th, 1858, British forces fully secured Gwalior. The rebellion's last major stronghold had fallen. Scattered resistance continued for months across central India, but the organized military challenge to British rule was effectively over. Tantia Tope continued guerrilla warfare until April 1859, when he was captured and hanged. Rao Sahib fled and was eventually caught and executed. Nana Sahib disappeared, his fate unknown, though British officials claimed he died in the jungles of Nepal. Damodar Rao, Lakshmibai's adopted son, was captured by the British. He was given a small pension, far less than his mother had received. He lived a quiet life, never regaining any power or status. When he died in 1906, the British noted his passing with indifference. The son of the fearsome Rani had become a footnote. Manikarnika Tambe, Lakshmibai's father, was captured after the fall of Jhansi. Despite his age and his daughter's appeals, he was hanged by the British as a traitor. He died without seeing his daughter again. Jalkari Bai and the other women warriors scattered after the final battle. Some sources claim Jalkari Bai disguised herself as the Rani during the escape from Jhansi, allowing Lakshmibai to escape while she was captured. Other sources say she survived the entire rebellion and lived into old age. Like much of this story, legend and history have become inseparable. The physical site where Lakshmibai died is in Pulbagh, in Gwalior. A memorial stands there now, a simple structure with her statue. Every year on June 18th, people gather to remember her, but her real memorial is not made of stone. Chapter 9. The Eternal Flame. In the decades following 1858, the British consolidated their control over India. The East India Company was dissolved, its power transferred to the British Crown. Queen Victoria became Empress of India. The rebellion was rebranded as the Indian Mutiny, or the Sepoy Mutiny, implying it was merely a military uprising rather than a broader war of independence. But the memory of Lakshmibai could not be controlled or diminished. In Indian homes, mothers told their daughters the story of the Queen, who fought on horseback. Teachers recounted her defiance in schools. Poets began writing verses about her courage. She became a symbol, an inspiration, proof that resistance was possible, even against impossible odds. In 1930, the poet Subhadra Kumari Chauhan wrote Jhansi Ki Rani, a poem that would be memorized by generations of Indian schoolchildren. Its most famous lines, "Khub-ladi mardani wo to Jhansi wali Rani thi." She fought like a warrior. Such was the Queen of Jhansi. The poem captured something essential about Lakshmibai. She had fought as an equal to any man, and often better than most. In a society that often restricted women, her story was revolutionary. Not because she was unusual for her time, many Indian women had fought and ruled throughout history, but because the British colonizers had promoted an image of Indian women as passive and helpless. Lakshmibai demolished that lie. During India's independence movement in the early 20th century, Lakshmibai became a rallying point. Freedom fighters invoked her name. Protesters carried her image. The struggle for independence drew strength from remembering those who had resisted before. Subhas Chandra Bose, the revolutionary leader who formed the Indian National Army to fight the British during World War II, created a women's regiment. He named it the Rani of Jhansi Regiment. These women soldiers trained in combat, intelligence and medicine. They saw themselves as inheritors of Lakshmibai's legacy, proof that women could serve as warriors in the fight for freedom. The regiment's existence infuriated the British authorities. The idea of Indian women organized and armed, claiming Lakshmibai's spirit, was deeply threatening to colonial power structures. When India finally achieved independence in 1947, Lakshmibai was immediately recognized as a national hero. Statues were erected across the country. Streets were renamed in her honor. Schools, colleges, and universities took her name. The state of Uttar Pradesh declared November 19th, her birthday, as Martyr's Day. But her legacy is more complex than simple heroism. Dalit communities, who face caste discrimination, have pointed out that Lakshmibai's army, while inclusive for its time, still operated within a caste system. Some freedom fighters supported British rule against the 1857 rebels. The rebellion itself was not a unified independence movement, but a complex clash of different interests. History is messy. Heroes are complicated. But what remains undeniable is this. When faced with injustice, Lakshmibai chose to fight rather than submit. When given a choice between comfortable survival and dangerous resistance, she chose resistance. When offered pensions and safety in exchange for her kingdom, she chose her kingdom. Main apni Jhansi nahin doongi. I will not give up my Jhansi. Those words still echo. In modern protests against injustice, activists have revived that phrase. Women facing discrimination invoke her name. Anyone who has been told to accept oppression quietly looks to her example and finds courage to resist. Her image has been reproduced in countless ways. Traditional art shows her on horseback, sword raised, defiant. Modern street art depicts her as a figure of empowerment. Bollywood films have portrayed her story, though with varying degrees of historical accuracy. Television series have dramatized her life. Children's books tell simplified versions of her journey. Some of these portrayals romanticize her. Some exaggerate her victories. Some simplify her choices. But the core story remains powerful precisely because it is true. She lived. She fought. She died on her own terms. In 2019, a major film called Manikarnika, the Queen of Jhansi, was released, starring and directed by Kangana Ranaut. The film drew crowds and controversy, praised for its depiction of female strength and criticized for historical liberties. But it proved that Lakshmibai's story still resonates, still matters, still inspires. The Maharani Lakshmibai Medical College in Jhansi treats patients in her name. The Rani Lakshmibai Central Agricultural University promotes agricultural education. The Lakshmibai National University of Physical Education in Gwalior trains athletes. Dozens of other institutions carry her legacy forward. But perhaps the most powerful testament to Lakshmibai is not in monuments or institutions. It's in the actions of those who remember her. When a young woman in rural India insists on her right to education, she carries Lakshmibai's spirit. When protesters stand against oppressive laws, they channel her refusal to surrender. When anyone, anywhere, faces overwhelming power and chooses defiance anyway, they honor the choice she made on the battlefield at Kota Ki Sarai. Sahyu Rose, the general who hunted her, the man who captured her kingdom and killed her forces, wrote that she was remarkable for her bravery, cleverness, and perseverance. He called her the most dangerous rebel leader he ever faced. Coming from an enemy, that is perhaps the highest honor. But Rose never understood what made her truly dangerous. It wasn't her military skill, though that was considerable. It wasn't her charisma, though that inspired thousands. It was her absolute refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. The British believed their empire was the natural order, that their rule was progress, that resistance was futile and foolish. Lakshmibai looked at that certainty and laughed. She proved that empires can be challenged, that overwhelming power can be resisted, that courage is contagious. 90 years after she died on that battlefield near Gwalior, India achieved independence. The British Empire that had seemed eternal crumbled. The doctrine of lapse was abandoned. The kingdoms that had been stolen were restored, then, eventually, merged into democratic India. Would independence have happened without Lakshmibai? Yes. The forces of history were larger than any one person. But did she matter? Absolutely. She showed that resistance was possible. She proved that women could lead. She demonstrated that dignity matters more than survival at any cost. She fought for her kingdom and her son, and in fighting for them, she fought for the idea that people have the right to rule themselves. Every nation that has thrown off colonial rule carries an echo of her defiance. Every woman who has taken up arms to defend her home stands in her shadow. Every parent who has fought for their child's future follows her path. The British tried to erase her. They destroyed Jhansi. They killed her soldiers. They scattered her followers. They controlled the historical record for decades, portraying the rebellion as a senseless mutiny and Lakshmibai as a villain, or, at best, a tragic figure who fought for a lost cause. But stories are harder to kill than people. Memory is more resilient than stone, and the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at suppression. Today, more than a century and a half after her death, Lakshmibai remains vividly alive in Indian consciousness. Children learn her story. Adults invoke her name. She has become what all the greatest heroes become, not just a person, but an idea. An idea that courage matters, that honor has value, that some things are worth dying for. Chapter 10. Closing. The legend lives. The sun is setting over Kota Ki Sarai. The battlefield is quiet now. Grass grows where soldiers fell. The blood has long since washed away. But if you stand very still, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it. The thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, the defiant cry of a woman who refused to surrender. Lakshmibai's physical body turned to ash on that funeral pyre in June 1858. But she left something behind that cannot burn, cannot be captured, cannot be defeated. She left the example, the memory, the inspiration. She was 22 or 29 years old when she died, depending on which birth date you believe. Either way, impossibly young. A lifetime of achievements compressed into months of desperate struggle. But in those months, she showed what one person can do when they choose courage over comfort, resistance over resignation, honor over survival. Her kingdom fell. Her army was destroyed. Her son was stripped of inheritance. Her father was executed. Everything she fought to protect was taken from her, and still she won. She won because she showed that the fight itself matters, that standing up to injustice has value beyond victory or defeat, that there are worse things than dying, like living on your knees. Every act of resistance since 1858 carries a spark of the fire she lit. Every person who has said no to oppression echoes her declaration, "I will not give up my Jhansi." The British Empire is gone now, dissolved like morning mist. The kingdoms it stole have transformed into the world's largest democracy. The doctrine of lapse is a historical curiosity. The certainty that any empire lasts forever has been proven false again and again. But Lakshmibai endures, not as a goddess, not as a perfect figure without flaws or failures, but as something more valuable, a real woman who made real choices, who faced real consequences, who fought for what she believed in until her final breath. Her story is not just history, it's a mirror. When we look at her choices, we're forced to examine our own. When we read about her courage, we're challenged to find our own. When we remember her refusal to surrender, we're asked, what would we do in her place? The answer to that question defines us. So remember her, the girl called Manu who learned to fight alongside boys, the queen who refused the purdah and continued to ride, the widow who would not perform sati but instead raised an army, the general who trained women as warriors, the mother who carried her son into battle, the ruler who chose death over dishonor. Remember the siege of Jhansi, where a city of 11,000 held off a professional army for 2 weeks. Remember the escape on horseback, a leap that should have been impossible but wasn't. Remember the final charge at Kota Ki Sarai, 2 swords in hand, reins in teeth, courage in heart. Remember that the British general who killed her called her the most dangerous rebel he ever faced. Remember that even her enemies acknowledged her bravery. Remember that 165 years after her death, Her name still inspires. Lakshmibai's tomb sits quietly in Fulbagh. Visitors come daily. They leave flowers. They bow their heads. They whisper thanks. But she is not truly there. She is everywhere, in every act of defiance, in every refusal to accept oppression, in every person who stands up for justice knowing they might lose, in every parent who fights for their children, in every leader who serves rather than rules, in every warrior who defends rather than conquers. The Lioness of Jhansi roars still. Her battle cry echoes across time. And as long as there are people who believe that freedom matters, that dignity matters, that courage matters, she will never truly die. This was her story. But more than that, it's a challenge, a question posed to everyone who learns it. What will you fight for? What will you refuse to surrender? When injustice comes to your door, will you negotiate with it? Or will you stand and say, as she did, "I will not give up what is mine"? The choice, as always, is yours. But choose knowing that a young queen once made the hardest choice of all, and in doing so, earned immortality. Hu bloody mardani woto Jhansi wali Rani thi. She fought like a warrior. Such was the Queen of Jhansi. These are not just stories. These are not ancient tales with no relevance to today. These are the echoes of real people who faced real evil and chose to fight rather than submit. Their courage is our inheritance. Their sacrifice is our responsibility to honor. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, then stand with us in keeping these memories alive. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear about courage today. Because the next legend is already out there, waiting to be told. And maybe, just maybe, that legend is being written right now by someone watching. Support those who stand. Remember those who fell. Carry the flame forward. The Lioness of Jhansi showed us the way. Now it's our turn to follow.